Welcome back to Alberta Primetime. At our nightly vocal point now, the Monday Money Panel welcomes a full slate of chief executive officers to explain an apparent lack of venture capital in Alberta and how it could be hurting all our futures. In Calgary tonight, Rod Charko, CEO of Alberta Enterprise. In studio with me, Randy Marsden, CEO of Cleankeys Inc., a successful new tech firm, and Chris Lumb, CEO of Tech Edmonton, which helps startups get going. Welcome, everybody, to Alberta Primetime.
Thank you.
Well, let me ask you first, Randy. Venture capital, as we know, is the money that makes new companies grow. So, quick report card. You're an entrepreneur. You've started several companies yourself. You've got a growing business now, making sterile computer keyboards for hospitals. How are we doing with venture capital in the province?
Report card, I'd say D-. I have to say, as an entrepreneur, we definitely have a problem with venture capital in Alberta.
Okay. Chris, is the problem that Alberta doesn't have enough investment capital coming here? Is that the issue?
Not at all. Not at all. There's plenty of investment capital in Alberta. The challenge is that most of it goes into the resource sector, and so there's very little that gets invested in emerging technology companies. And you might say that's okay because we are a resource-based economy, but I would argue that it's not okay because we will hollow out the rest of our economy, and I don't think we want to be in a situation where we're precariously living off one industry.
Give me some figures on the flow of money in Canada, what's coming to Alberta.
Okay, so some basic numbers are we have about 11% of the population of Canada. We have about 14% of the gross domestic product. This is in Alberta. We have about 22% of the total capital investment made in Alberta, lots, but only about 5% of all of the venture capital invested in Alberta.
Sucked up by oil and gas,
That's
the rest
right.
of it.
That's right. Yeah.
Rod, is the problem, you hold a lot of the purse strings at Alberta Enterprise, is the problem that there just maybe aren't enough good ideas, good innovations in Alberta to attract more venture capital here?
Well, that's not really the case. If you actually talk to a lot of venture capitalists that come here, they'll all comment there's a lot of smart people, a lot of scientists and innovation. The challenge they'll point out is that there's a real lack of management expertise. And what I really mean by that is people that understand how to do a startup, take it commercial, take it global, develop sales channels in particular industries such as ICT, biotech, clean technologies, and alternatives. So it's more to do with skill set and mentoring and background than it is just raw money.
Randy, do you agree with that?
Well, you know, I'm one of those guys, so I'm hoping I have the skill set. You know, I think Rod may be right. There's a lot more mentoring that can happen, say, in Silicon Valley, where guys have already been through that process and done it. So it's a bit of a catch-22. And until we can get that infrastructure and those kind of people here in Alberta to help mentor entrepreneurs, it's always going to be the case. So the goal is to try to have some wins and then have those entrepreneurs come back and help the rest of us who are still trying.
I know that that's something that you call super angels, and I want to get more into that in just a moment. But first, one of your other thoughts on the problems with venture capital in our province really kind of took me a little off guard. Success elsewhere. You've actually had investors say, well, I'll help you out if you move it out of Alberta. Really?
Absolutely. I've been told that for my own companies. In fact, I had to do that for a company that I co-founded called Swipe. Very successful company in Seattle now. I just couldn't get any traction here in Alberta. Another company in the news lately, Picomole, had to move from Alberta to Quebec because investors said, we'll invest in you, but you have to come here.
Why?
You know, there's incentives in other provinces that don't exist in Alberta, tax incentives that are to the benefit of the investor to invest in small business. We don't have that kind of incentive in Alberta yet.
Chris, you would think that in Alberta, of all places, especially one run by a Conservative government, we'd have lots of tax incentives.
Well, we don't. We don't in Alberta. We have a generally favorable tax regime overall, but some provinces have chosen to specifically incent emerging technology industries because they believe that's the economy of the future. And Alberta has chosen not to do that to anything like the same extent. But I don't think this should be a diatribe against government. I don't think that's the issue. The solution is not an easy one because the issue isn't we just need more venture capital or we need more government assistance. The issue is really a systemic issue, and we need to have all elements of the innovation chain working. And if any one of those elements doesn't work, then you don't get the successful outcome of lots of growing, emerging technology-based companies. So Rod mentioned management capability, mentoring, there's fiscal incentives, there's the experience of having the venture capitalists here. There's all sorts of different things that need to take place to make it happen, and we need to work on every one of those.
Rod, is that happening? Is that work being done? And especially, maybe you want to address sort of the investment mechanism particularly.
Yeah, it is being done, and I can comment surely on what we're doing at Alberta Enterprise, which is to attract not just capital, but what we'll term as intelligent capital. So we are bringing investors here whose business it is to invest and help technology companies grow in IT and biotech and others. We're also helping to develop what we call the ecosystem to help the entrepreneurs and the startups get closer to those investors, but also to help them to understand how to build better boards, help them to understand how to build better business plans, how to pitch to investors, and to better get them ready to compete in the world marketplace.
Well, Alberta entrepreneurialism is famous, especially here in our province. Who would have thought there were so many issues with venture capital and helping startups? We're going to explore a little bit more about the issues in Alberta, and we're going to find out what a super angel is and how we can get more of them in our province, why they'd be good for all of us, no matter what kind of a job we have. More with our Monday Money panel on Alberta's venture capital void after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Alberta Primetime and a special Monday Money panel of Alberta CEOs. Tonight we're talking about venture capital. It's the money that fuels new companies. And Randy Marsden from Cleankeys, Inc., one of the things you think we're lacking in Alberta to help diversify the economy, to help get new companies growing here, is something called a super angel. Explain what that is and why we don't have enough of them.
You know, a super angel is usually somebody who has done really well in a certain field and they've made some money and they put that money back into investing in that field. That's how Silicon Valley has built up. In Alberta, we actually have pretty good programs to help startup companies do R&D, to help us get to that first step. Usually you use friends and family and fools to get started. Programs like Chris's to help companies prepare to pitch to investors and that sort of thing. But when we talk about real venture capital, they're usually looking for companies that are a little further along than a startup.
So there's a gap.
Excuse me. And there's that gap. And usually that's filled with startup seed funds or super angels, as they're called, individuals, but they have more than $25,000 or $50,000. They might be putting in $500,000 to help a company. And we have a shortage of those in Alberta, for sure.
You were saying you think you know where most of them have left and gone to.
Well, you know, I was down in Silicon Valley 2 weeks ago, and there's over 250,000 expat Canadians living in Silicon Valley. We've had a brain drain. A lot of our skilled people are down there making successes. People that you wouldn't have thought were Canadian are down there heading some of these really
and with bucks behind them to reinvest.
Absolutely.
Rod, how do we get that deal flow back up here?
Well, I think we got to clarify one thing. I think a lot of the angels you're referring to in Silicon Valley didn't necessarily make their money here. They made their careers down there, and that's where they're flourishing. There are actually super angels here in Alberta, but they work in oil and gas. And so what we really need to do is develop the investor skill set around investments in IT and investments in internet and medical devices and so on. So, you know, part of what we're doing is actually reaching out to those angels in Silicon Valley, a group that call themselves the C100, and we've also created an analog group here called the A100. And part of that is an attempt to mix the skills, the mentoring, the board capacity of men and women that have made money in high tech and try to plow it back, sort of give back to the up-and-comers, if you will. So it's still early days for that, but what we're trying to do is mix skill set and mentoring with money.
Chris, at Tech Edmonton, you get funding from a variety of sources. It would seem by your very existence that you've got your own super angels and we're okay maybe in that department.
I wouldn't say we're all okay in the area of super angels, but I'll talk a little bit about why Tech Edmonton exists. It's really quite a visionary organization in that it was set up by the university and the city of Edmonton, the University of Alberta and the city of Edmonton, with the intent to keep the outcomes of research and development that's done in the region by creating successful and growing companies in the region.
Because some good ideas start here and then get a little bit successful and leave, right?
Historically, that's been a sad trend, yes.
Why?
Well, Randy mentioned some of the reasons. There's availability of capital elsewhere, maybe availability of expertise elsewhere. And we feel that if we can get the ecosystem growing, that we get a community of super angels, a community of people who've started and grown and run companies, then that will feed on itself and it will continue to happen. And that's already happening. We've achieved some pretty exciting outcomes in the last 5 years. And so certainly one organization like Tech Edmonton is not the answer to the whole problem, but it's one part, it's one cog in the wheel, as is AEC and many other elements of the solution.
And just ask Randy, because you still feel frustration from some of the ventures that you've had to work through problems with. What are the answers, the other answers to solving Alberta's venture capital crunch?
Well, I think there's two things that need to happen. One is us as industry need to tout our successes more. We need to let the super angels that are in the energy sector know that they can also maybe even do better in the tech sector. Historically, IT and return on investment from venture capital has been 95% of all.
And nobody would guess that, would they?
Yeah, I mean, it's in Alberta, we kind of shy away from that. So I think we need to talk about our successes in Alberta. Companies like Intuit and BioWare, Matricon just had a very successful exit. There's dozens of companies that have been technology-based, very successful in Alberta. So I think we as an industry need to explain that better to the public. But the second thing, I believe, is tax incentives. If the government can do one thing for us, that would be to help incent investors to invest in small startup tech companies.
Because just quickly gauge for us, are we, say, at about a 10% tax incentive level, whereas Quebec, for example, which does really well at this, might be 30%? Is that a fair gauge?
We have an R&D tax credit of 10%. We're tied for lowest in Canada. Other provinces have 30%, 37% in Quebec.
Which is why the money goes there.
British Columbia and Ontario are tied with us at 10%, but they also have something called a small business venture capital tax credit of 30%.
And we don't have
and
that
we don't
in
have
Alberta.
that. Yeah.
Rod, why is this so important to all Albertans and all of our futures?
Well, I think, as was alluded to earlier, as Chris discussed, we're under extreme pressure from the world point of view in terms of oil and gas and where it's going. It makes a lot of money now or a lot of sense now, but there's, for our kids, for our future, we need to diversify the economy. And there's tremendous opportunities to be had in the internet space, in medical devices, and even in clean tech and alternative fuels. Part of what we're doing is to reach out not just to traditional tech investors, but also the local P&E and energy and exploration and production investors as well, because they need to understand that carbon-based fuel technologies is their future today, but they need to look at alternative technologies, alternative materials, alternative fuels as well. And I think long-term, if Alberta wants to be a leader in the world economy, it can't just be a carbon-based energy leader, it needs to be an energy leader.
Chris, Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced 2011 just recently, declared it as the year of the entrepreneur, saying that they are the backbone of our economy. Lots of talk, enough action?
What he says is very true. So quoting some other interesting numbers, according to the National Research Council of Canada, 80% of new Canadian jobs come from companies under 5 years old, which means that startups, small business is really creating the future of our economy. So he's right. There are lots of things that the federal government, the provincial government can do to support that. And it's good to hear that there's that kind of recognition of the importance of entrepreneurship in government.
We'll see if the other elements start to come on track here in Alberta. Thank you all for enlightening us as to what's needed, and perhaps we'll have to update the situation in the next little while and see how things are going. Thank you for joining us.
You're
Thanks
welcome.
for having us.
You're welcome.
Rod Charko is CEO of Alberta Enterprise in Calgary tonight. Randy Marsden, CEO of Cleankeys Inc., and Chris Lumb is CEO of Tech Edmonton.